Continuing on from our video on the DLC speculation for Lizardmen, let's move away from our cold-blooded bros and over to our cold-hearted ones. The Skaven have a lot of things missing from their roster, and of all those, many things they fit into a particular niche in their army. Half of what makes Skaven so awesome is their perversion of the Empire standard regimental troops. Also, the randomness. There's so much randomness in tabletop that only a small portion was translated into Total War. Historically, Skaven had a weird place on the power curve as far as tiers go in tabletop. If you got good rolls, then they were disgustingly strong. If you got poor rolls, they were disgusting. But there were always laughs to be had. But just like we started with our lords for Lizardmen, let's go into that option here. And we've discussed a number of these guys in their own respective videos, but if we're talking about Shriya and a direct conflict with the Lizardmen, I think we can rule out people like Throt the Unclean. My two biggest contenders are Ikit Claw and Thankful, and the latter is really more because of my want for him more than anything. I don't really see him as being well grounded in a Lustrian conflict. There are plenty of iterations in the lore where he is all over the map, so he could really feasibly be wherever Creative Assembly wanted to place him. Thankful has just kind of come in and out of the lore wherever he kind of sees the most fit. Now, Ikit is pretty crazy from a lore standpoint. He's essentially a Skaven Space Marine librarian. Let me break this down. He has the Skaven equivalent of power armor, he's a warlock with magic spells, and then has a flamethrower attached to his armor in addition to a gnarly close combat weapon. This guy is like a fucking float during a parade, shooting flames, bolts of warp lightning, and half-naked Skaven slaves dancing all over the place. In addition to his abilities, he'd bring a great focus for Clan Skryre, as nearly all the missing units of Skaven roster are from Clan Skryre's laboratories. Now let's jump in on Ikit's abilities real quick though. I mean, he is a warlock, so again, we would be seeing the Spells of Ruin on the character, our first warlock special character in the faction, which I find pretty fitting. You know, we have a Plague caster, and 2 melee lords, and this will give us the legendary lord Ruins caster, decked in power armor, screaming, "For the Under Emperor, yes, yes!" And as far as his loadout goes, his Ironframe, or what I've been joking calling power armor, would give him a substantial amount of, well, armor, way above normal Skaven means, maybe in the 100 or 125 range, with a ward save. And we've talked about that in our last video. That ward save might just be an implied physical resistance buff, but I really like to see a ward save added to this character, as ward saves are quite rare in the Skaven army. And what makes the Ironframe so special outside of its inherent defenses are its offensive capabilities. It increases Ikit's strength to 5, which normally would have been 2 in tabletop. So I see this as a translation to an above average weapon strength for our little Verminous chapter master. The Warlock Engineer, which is a hero choice, has 280 weapon strength. Ikit's, I'd imagine, would be in line with a Warlord at 400 weapon strength, possibly even higher. Most caster hybrids have over 400 weapon strength. Malekith sits pretty at 420, with Archaon at 470 and Manfred at 480. So the precedent is definitely already there and been set, and the latter two having vastly higher strength values than Malekith in tabletop. The other offensive capability of the Ironframe is the Warp Fire Thrower that is housed within the armor, allowing Ikit to spew fire from the gauntlet of one of his power fists. I mean, there's something else that's totally not related to Warhammer 40,000 at all. And I can see this as sort of a breath attack that Ikit has access to, much like Throg's Spit ability or the Hydra's Fire Breath, but of course on a much more focused scale. Lastly, Ikit has the Magic Halberd Storm Demon, which has the built-in typical characteristics of a halberd, you know, anti-large and AP, with the obvious magic damage this bad boy would confer. Now, there is an additional bit of spice, I guess you could say, to this thing. It had a bound magic missile spell in tabletop, wherein it launched a huge bolt of dark lightning from its tip. And again, I could see this as a bound spell, maybe simply being a warp lightning. We kind of get that with Marathi, but it'd be nice if this was a bound spell that launched an actual missile of magic, something like the Gaze of Mork, but more, you know, warp lightning looking, and doing a high shot of AP damage to the target. A great way to make Ikit a ranged threat while he charges into combat, supported by Storm Vermin. Now, where would Ikit Claw start? And this one is pretty easy, as Clan Skryre is already on the campaign map for the Vortex campaign, starting in the Jungle of Green Mists at the Pillars of the Unseen Constellation. And if this is true, and if 10-1 starts in the northern Great Jungle at Chakwa, then that makes for a very turbulent northern Lustria, with only one province, the northern Spire of Sotek, barring the two factions. And we had really more to theorize and talk about with the Lizardmen, right? We were talking about so many different options for how the Lizardmen could be incorporated, but I think with Clan Scryer and the Lizardmen, like I said, it's a pretty easy one-to-one translation here. Oh, Lizardmen are already on the map. I'm sorry, Clan Scryer's already on the map. Let's just plop them here. It makes the most sense, and which I'm all for. The northern portion of Lustria has always been a little too sparse, but this will give Dark Elves to the south, a Skrulk to the southeast, Orcs to the north, and Lizardmen to the northeast. This is a nice kind of insulation, because Lizardmen can be a very tough early game opponent for Skaven without Plague Priests from Skrulk, giving it the ability to expand without too much opposition. But then again, maybe his new units will give him an edge. It's really going to be up to how they determine how Ikit's passive campaign abilities are going to be. I could see this being something along the lines of a lot of reduction in cost and upkeep cost for any of the Clan Scryer units that we're soon to talk about, or a lot of bonuses towards any Warlock Engineers that you recruit, wins and magic bonuses, stuff like that. Because I look at the Warlock Engineer as more of a hybrid lord, in the sense that he is going to be more melee centric and he is going to have a lot of casting abilities. And the same thing that we see with 10-1, right? He is a bit of a hybrid caster character. So this kind of fits very well into the theme that we've created across these two speculation videos for how these lords are going to turn out. Now, as for generic lords for Skaven, we might see a similar treatment to something like I proposed for the Lizardmen, a non-existing tabletop lord to fill the niche that the legendary lord that's being added creates. So, a Master Warlock, someone that with high AP, anti-large profile, as well as the Lore of Ruin. That's not something we currently have either. Tretch comes close by being anti-large, but he only has 120 AP. So this would be a great character to help deal with larger target lords. And again, and thematic with the Scryer theme we've got going on so far. I mean, we do have the Lore of Ruin access to a Grey Seer, but that's really the only way that you get the Lore of Ruin in a lord choice for Skaven. Now, as far as wildcards go, though, I know I've always talking about adding a little wildcards to these speculation videos, so I think it's time we jump into one. And my big pick for that. It's the Vermin Lord, the mighty great demon of the horned rat, as it were. And we've seen this guy teased in a lot of cinematics during the Vortex campaign, so it's really just a matter of time before he shows up at this point. I mean, he's in every single race's Vortex campaign cinematic. But adding the Vermin Lord to the game will give the Skaven access to a huge centerpiece lord, one that is monstrous and can go toe-to-toe with some of the larger and, well, arguably more competitive lords out there on their monstrous steeds. In addition, it adds so much flavor to the army. Even though the mechanic of the Vermin Lords being dedicated to various factions of Skavendom is from the end times, I'd argue that it was intended for the 8th edition Skaven army book that never really came out. And of course, this adds so much flavor to the inherent values of a Vermin Lord. If you want him to be Clan Eshin themed, he's going to be a little bit more of an assassin, heavy damage dealer, less of an actual tank. Or you can have him Clan Pestilence themed, which maybe is a little bit more of an area effect, kind of multi-unit damaging lord. Or Scryer, which would be maybe more focused on heavy AP single target damage from range. Or Mulcher, which would maybe be heavy AP anti-infantry, large beast style. It doesn't really, I'm really just kind of speaking off the top of my head on that one, but of course, that will lead to another end times unit I like to see added that we'll talk about a little bit. But with that lord choice, we're going to want a hero choice, right? Did you guys ever read that fucking book, If You Give a Moose a Cookie, when you were growing up? Well, if you give a Skaven a legendary lord, they will want a hero with it. And really, that's a definite, there's like one definite standout option here, right? A Skaven chieftain. Right now, if you take a caster lord for the Skaven, you can't really support them with any strong melee combatants outside of the assassin, which is, great offensively, but not so much defensively. And when I say melee combatants here, I'm strictly speaking from a hero standpoint. Now, when you take Alariel with the High Elves, or the Fey Enchantress with Bretonnia, you can deck your army out with High Elf Nobles or Bretonnian Paladins to act as sort of fierce melee hunters as defenders of their weaker lords and ladies. So adding a Skaven chieftain that can access maybe the Bonebreaker from the Skaven warlord would make for a great little AP powerhouse to go roving around the battlefield, much in the same way that we see for other factions with similarly strong melee hero choices. Now, I unfortunately don't have a cool wildcard choice for our hero here, because any hero choice like a Packmaster or a Harbinger of Mutation or a Master Molder, would almost surely be with a Throth the Unclean DLC or just something more Clan Mulcher themed. In fact, I think a lot of the options for rat swarms or giant rats or things that are particularly Clan Mulcher-ish is going to be more in line with a Clan Mulcher themed DLC. Since I'm kind of on the Clan Skryre kick, I think I'm going to stick with that. I mean, that's not to say that we won't get them with a themed DLC, nor is it to say that this isn't that DLC, but it just doesn't seem that way, nor does it make much sense to me, as I'm sticking with my Clan Skryre. So let's move on then, on to the real juicy part of this video, the DLC speculation for the units of the Skaven. And really, a lot of them stem from the same unit choice in Tabletop. You see in Tabletop, Warp Fire Throwers, Rattling Guns, Warpstone Grinders, Mortars, all of them were called Skaven Weapon Teams. And sticking with my Skryre speculation, fleshing out the Skaven weapon teams makes the most sense. These were all mini or quote-unquote diet versions of something else in the army, for the most part. The grinder was kind of its own construct. But what does that all include, though? One of my favorite Skaven weapon teams is the Magic Bullet. It slices, it dices, it minces, all in minutes. Which, to be totally honest, aside from being just a fucking terrible joke, isn't far off from one of the weapon teams, the Doomflayer. This spiky ball of destruction is sort of like a diet Doom Wheel. And I don't envision this so much as a chariot like the Doom Wheel, but maybe a small unit-sized monstrous or construct level cav option. There's the big question, right? Is this a single entity unit or a small 8 to 12 size unit? If the latter, again, more of a cav option, but if it's the former, it would have to have some unique traits that raise it above, or at least in line or below, a Doom Wheel. You have to have some sort of key differentiator. And in the Tabletop, this thing had a situational armor save. 3 up in the front and 5 up on any flanking attacks. But I don't see, or at least I don't think we'd see something so granular in Total War. Just a generic high armor save, anti-infantry, armor-piercing Mulcher of a unit is what I envision for this thing. Now, another Skaven weapons team is the Poisoned Wind Mortar. There's not really much to elaborate with this thing. I mean, the name kind of fucking says it all, right? Much like when you see a sign that says store closing on a Halloween store in summer. Sort of just kind of saw that one coming, right? What makes these unique is that they are a mobile artillery platform, able to move quickly rather than being tied down to a set artillery piece. Again, a diet version of something else, the Poison Claw Catapult, but of course a mortar shot. So I think of a larger blast radius with the same poison damage profile as its bigger brother. Saving the best for last, of course, the Rattling Gun is the real winner and badass option for the Skaven. A 2-man or 2-rat team of Skaven hold a Skaven minigun that spews Skaven Warpstone downrange and an astonishing rate of fire. And when I saw units like the Vampire Coast Zombie Deck Gunners, I immediately thought, basic framework for Rattling Guns, complete. And I mean, they'll work. I imagine much in the same way, a small unit count, albeit a shorter range, anti-infantry AP range damage unit, which is huge, as the Skaven don't really have access to a decently ranged AP unit outside of their Globadiers and their Warp Lightning Cannon. Of course, the Globadiers, though, have a pretty short range, while, of course, the Warp Lightning Cannon has a pretty long range. Now, speaking of 2-rat teams, we can talk about Warp Block Jezzails, which are essentially Skaven snipers with a Pavis. And these are a unit, alongside the Rattling Guns, that people have really, I really think they've wanted the most. I mean, they're really the two I went looking for when I started looking at the Skaven roster way back when the game first came out. And this would, again, give AP to the Skaven ranged arsenal, but at a significant range, perhaps with a Sunder Armor ability, as they use a special Warpstone bullet. And the Pavis would help out with return fire from range units, giving them probably a silver, if not a bronze, at least, with their ranged missile defense. In addition, that Pavis gave them a 4-up save in Tabletop, so I see this as a decent amount of armor on the unit as a whole, maybe even a charge defense against large, something that kind of hints more to that, allowing them to fare a bit better in concerted charge efforts or combat than any of their more, I guess, just on-foot foes, or bros. Now, moving on to something I think the Skaven really need, and that's a form of fast skirmisher cav. To really answer those backline or vanguard threats almost every single race has access to. Skaven can be an outright terror when it comes to vanguard deployment via their mini runner variant of Clan Eshin, but I couldn't decide between, wolf rats or giant rats. And really, wolf rats just seem like the cooler option here. So let's go with them from the Monstrous Arcanum. Giant rats are actually in the 7th edition army book, but wolf rats fit more into the skirmisher cav role that the giant rats, which were in an actual large block of giant rats, don't quite fit. So again, reiterating because I confused myself even speaking there, giant rats were a single block unit, whereas wolf rats were not of that ilk. Now, I don't envision anything crazy for these guys, for the exception of maybe fear or even, hear me out on this, a discourage mechanic as part of their melee attack to really help them pressure the back line of factions that can outrange them, such as Empire, Vampire Coast, or even High Elves. I think if they don't have something like this, and they're already lackluster leadership as, being Skaven, makes it a little bit hard for them to have a very far-ranging unit to attack a backline because, granted, after the charge happens, they're just going to flee away. So if they cause discourage, or if they have fear, which then will in turn make them immune to fear, just like in tabletop, then that is a great way to kind of help them add a little bit more extra impact and effectiveness to their damage. This could actually eventually blossom into wolf rat riders, which are storm vermin with halberds on wolf rat models. But that might be a little bit too far-fetched for this DLC. Sounds a little bit more like a clan molder thing to me. Now, for our wildcard unit, I went with storm fiends. I think variants of the rat ogres need to exist. They're very strong and effective units on their own, worth 800 points in multiplayer, and delivering some very cheap and effective AP. They're great guardians for your caster lord, but their staying power and terrible leadership can make them lackluster against even a minor concerted effort at shutting them down. A Storm Fiend is a horrifying armored and stronger version of a Red Ogre, and this was of course the End Times unit I was talking about, that is honestly just so badass that I really want to see it either as a single entity or a modified unit of Rat Ogres. In my video on the Skaven Regiments of Renown, I even considered it as a possible Regiment Renown unit of Rat Ogres. But Storm Fiends definitely need to be in this game some way or another. They offer so many different options to the Skaven because they can be outfitted with so many different arm weapons, turning them into Skaven Terminators, Clan Scryer, remember? I mean, they're all about this kind of shit. And this fits that awesome theme of modification upon original units, turning them into overly weaponized, skittering beasts of destruction. Now, another cool unit I had considered was the Rat Tank, which is exactly what it sounds like, a Skaven steam tank. And seeing as how steam tanks are really struggling with their place in the meta and their usefulness overall, this might be an absolute long shot, right? But at the same time, it would be an awesome way to fix the steam tank and add the rat tank at the same time. Because, you know, hey, if you're going to add the rat tank, you're not going to have the steam tank still be a hulking piece of shit. You're going to fix them both at once. Either way, that shores up my speculative list of units for the Skaven. Overall, I think this DLC is going to bring a lot of color to these two factions, the Lizardmen and the Skaven, as we're possibly looking at new variations of the hulking dinosaurs that fill the Lizardmen roster, as well as tons of different warpstone creations from the Skaven list. And this is a very long time coming too, as the Skaven and Lizardmen need this breath of fresh air to revitalize these factions in a pretty major way. There's no saying what could happen with their mechanics as well. I mean, we might be getting something where the Vermin Lord acts as the Sword of Cain mechanic from Queen of the Crone, delivering an existential objective to the Skaven outside of the Vortex campaign. But one that also creates a huge power spike for them. We've talked about some other stuff for the Lizardmen, like Lord Croak being tied to something similar to this, or even a mechanic like the Green Knight, where Lord Croak or gor-rok or something like that can be summoned up with enough, I don't know, tablets of the old ones, or lessons from Teapot, whatever the hell it is. But maybe some of my ideas are completely harebrained, but maybe they're just dumb enough to work. Either way, guys, thanks so much for watching here today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comment section what some of the units that your votes are for big Skaven units to be added with this DLC. Follow along my hobby crusade with the Blood Angels on Patreon, but as always guys, have a good one and take care.